Hello and welcome to our interview, the second in our series with Jennifer Crusie as part of Romantic Rendezvous Lockdown. I'm Sharon Sherry. Jennifer Crusie is the New York Times, USA Today and Publishers Weekly bestseller and author of 20 novels, plus a book of literary criticism, miscellaneous articles, essays, novellas and short stories. And she has a very active blog, which you can head on over and check out as well. She's also the editor of 3 essay anthologies, as if, that wasn't enough on her plate. Jenny lives in a cottage in New Jersey, surrounded by deer, bears, foxes, and dachshunds, where she often stares at the ceiling and counts her blessings. At the Talk with Amy Andrews, Jenny spoke about a number of things, and I get the opportunity now to ask her a bunch of other questions. So Jenny, welcome, and thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you so much for asking me. This is so much fun.
All right, let's dive on into getting to know Jenny. So let's talk about
a bad idea.
Well, feel free to say move on.
All my flaws.
We all have them. So let's talk about where you are in the world during quarantine. That's in New Jersey in a cottage, as I mentioned in the intro. Are you on a lot of land, with fresh air and space, or is it a typical sized block?
It's a very old private community, which I didn't know when I bought. That it was built in the 30s for people who lived in New York City who wanted to get out of the city in the heat. New York's about an hour from here. So as you can imagine, we're ground zero for the virus in the United States. But it's on a very small man-made lake. It's just over half an acre. It's all trees, and I'm at the top of the hill in this cottage that was completely derelict when I bought it and is not that much better now, although we do have insulation and plumbing. So I think that was a big, improvement. And it's paradise. I love it. It's just beautiful.
So at least you're not housebound. You can get outside during this pandemic at least and breathe some air.
Well, I can get into the side yard with the dogs, so that's nice, and it's beautiful here. And my neighbors are also being very careful. They wave at me from the yards and everything, and we talk across the fence. And they're all lovely people too. So it's just very quiet, and it's a perfect place for writers.
Nice. Have you lived there long?
It's about 8 years now. Time flies when you're having fun. I just realized that the other day that much time had passed. It's kind of a timeless place.
Well, it's rather nice for a writer, isn't it?
It's perfect.
So during lockdown, have you started doing things like, baking bread, doing craft or other new things like many others during this surreal period? For myself, no. I've taken up knitting and binge watching reruns of police procedurals.
I'm rereading a lot of books. I haven't watched television at all. I've always been a crocheter, so that wasn't anything new. The thing about the quarantine for me is this is the way I've always lived. I'm very quiet. Most of my social life is on the internet. My best friend lives in Vermont. That's Ann Stewart. Another really close friend is Lisa Whitney, and she's someplace up north of New York. So we don't get together very often, but we do stay in touch with, FaceTime and things like that. So this just isn't different for me. This is the way I've always lived. The big difference is that there are some things I can't do now, like I can't go to Home Goods and buy sheets, but it's not exactly, a tragedy. So it's been very easy for me. Now my daughter, who has 3 kids and whose husband is an editor in New York, they're all stuck in one house together and have been for a while. And I think she's ready to rip the doors off. But for me, it's been very easy.
Well, they've had a tough time, a really tough time.
Yeah.
So I'm always interested in the career paths of authors, as, very few start out with that job in mind. What types of roles have you done away from writing and before you decided to become a full-time author?
Well, I was a huge reader as a child, of course. We all were. And when I went to college, my mother told me I had to be a teacher because that way I'd always have a job and I could quit when my children were born and be a stay-at-home mother. My mother really didn't have a grasp on my personality, I think. So I became an art teacher. I would have been an art major with a journalism minor in photography. And I taught art for quite a few years. I got married before I graduated from college, and had a child and taught art. And then my life kind of blew up. And I decided I was going to change things. So I went back and got a master's in literature and began to teach English. Not a huge change. And a couple of years later, I thought, I've always wanted to write a book. So I do not recommend this, okay? Don't anybody do what I did. I quit my job without having any book contract or anything. I was just going to become a writer. And I did go to grad school, so I had a stipend. I went to grad school to study literature. And again, and I started writing fiction. And I quit in June, and I sold my first book in August, which was a little novella. I had entered a contest. And then after that, it just, I laughed when you said career path, because it's more of a stagger, you know? I didn't really have a plan. But it was at a time, it was the late 90s, and it was at a time, well, no, actually early 90s. My first book was published in 93, when romance wasn't getting any respect or any money, but it was selling like crazy. So you get $5,000 for a book, but you'd sell a lot of books. You know, it worked differently than it does now. And I just loved it so much, I went back for another graduate degree, this time in fiction. And that was a big help. I learned a lot in my MFA. And just kept studying and writing and enjoying everything. And at that point, I was so much a part of the romance community. All my close friends were romance writers. So we're kind of living in this bubble where everything is about fiction and everything is about craft. It was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And it went on that way until I went through menopause. And when I hit menopause, I had a very easy menopause, except I put on about 300 pounds and my brain started to dribble out. I couldn't think anymore. And that's when I started to collaborate, because I just couldn't get to the end of a book. And I was surrounded by wonderful writers who could. So I did a lot of collaborations then and then. So it's, you know, it was really a zigging, zagging. I didn't have a plan. I know there are a lot of people who do have wonderful business plans, and I really recommend that, because I just kind of lurched from one thing to another.
Well, it ended up well for you and for those of us who are your readers. Do you remember the feeling when you sold your first book?
You know, people ask about that, and it was such a weird situation. But the thing I remember most, and I will try not to cry as I say this, because I cry every time, I really didn't think I was smart enough to write a book. And I wrote one, and I printed it out, and it was 160,000 words and totally unpublishable, but I didn't know that. But I printed it out, and I put it on the table, and I looked at that and thought, I wrote a book. I can write a book. I'm good, you know? And I just sat there and cried because I'd done it. I don't think I've ever had another moment that was that intense as that moment when I thought, I can do this. I have done this. It was marvelous.
Nice when you prove yourself wrong.
Pardon?
Nice when you can prove yourself wrong.
Right. Well, it wasn't even me. It was all those people around me going, just sit there and have kids and be a wife. They were all wrong.
Absolutely. So let's move on to the type of things that you like to read. Are there favourite tropes that you like to read? And is there one that maybe you haven't written and you'd like to?
You know, there are some that I look at and think, I shouldn't like that. That's a wrong trope to like. And I go for it every time. Like the marriage of convenience in all its different permutations, you know? There's just something about that that really appeals to me. And every time I read another one, I think, oh, this is ridiculous, Jenny, you know better than this. And then I go head first into it again because it's so wonderful. So I do like that. And I think it's a corollary or an analog to that friends to enemies or enemies to friends thing, where, you know, they're completely wrong for each other, but they're completely right. And there's just something about watching the one I call it, what I call it when I write it is, oh God, not you. You know, of all the people in the world to fall in love with, please God, not you. But it's so wonderful then, because when they do fall in love, sorry about this, allergies. When they do fall in love, you know, they have done everything possible not to. So this one's going to, you know, this has to be. And I do love that one. As far as ones I've never written, I'm really sorry about dripping all over this chat. I don't think so. I've tried a lot of things. It's been fun. One of the things I really do like is writing bad sex. You know, the first time they have sex and it's terrible. That's so much fun. I really like undercutting the. I've got a scene in one of the books that's not finished yet, where she walks out and this beautiful woman is embracing him. And he comes back after it's done and he says, listen. And she says, that was your sister, wasn't it? And he goes, yeah. And she says, looks just like you, and goes back in. I like undercutting those, you know, those really annoying tropes, the big misunderstanding. So that's fun. Let's face it, writing romance is just fun.
Well, if you can get some fun out of your job, that's what you want to be able to do, because then it's never really a job, right? Isn't that what they say?
I was just going to say, I've never really thought of it as a job. Teaching was a job, and I loved that. But this always just seems like making stuff up for fun and profit, you know.
Sounds good to me. So, Jenny, how do you research your books when you are writing?
I go to Google. I don't do a lot of research-heavy books, unless it's something I'm really fascinated by, like art theft or forgery or running a con or something like that. That's something I'd read about anyway. Right now with the Surprise Lily book, I bought some books, some magazines basically on Vikings, because I don't want to know a lot about Vikings. I just want to know enough that I can look at a picture and go, oh, you know what would be cool? I could do this. You know, it's more for inspiration. I don't care if I get the Vikings right, because it's not about the Vikings. You know, it's about all these people dealing with Vikings in 2020. So I don't do a lot of intense research. If it's something where she says something as a fact, then I make sure it's a fact, because I don't want her, you know, you've read books where somebody was writing about your specialty and said something completely ridiculous, and you think, oh yeah, you know what you're doing. I remember watching a TV show once where a woman wrote a book and it was published 2 weeks later, and you just think, you know, couldn't you have called somebody? That doesn't happen. So that kind of thing I tend to check on, but you can get anything in Google. So
Google is your friend. So have any of your characters been inspired by people you know?
No. And the reason for that is I like to discover my characters. I do a lot of collage, and I use a lot of pictures, but I tend to try to use like 2 or 3 different pictures for the same character. So I'm not mimicking, so many of them are actors, because that's all the pictures, you know, on the net. And I don't want to mimic any role any of them have had. It's more finding pictures that reflect an attitude or something. You look at him and you go, I know what kind of guy that is, and build a composite. And then usually a couple months into the book, the pictures fall away and I've just got the guy in my head and he does what he wants. But I don't see basing it on a real person as a plus. I mean, it was terribly tempting in this book I just finished to put in a Donald Trump analog and do horrible things to him. I really wanted to do that. Plus, he has so many great quotes. You know, like, I have a very fine brain. Who says that? So actually, that one is in there. The bad guy does say that. But it's just too restrictive to base it on a real person.
Fair enough. So, of your 20 fiction books, which one was the easiest for you to write and which one was the hardest?
The easiest was Anyone But You.
Why is
For
that?
some reason, I wrote that in 6 weeks. I still look back on it. This last book I'm working on, 5 years. Anyone but you, 6 weeks. I don't know why. I just hit the ground running and I knew what I wanted to do with it. And it was so much fun. And there was a dog. Dogs make everything easier. I don't know why that was so easy. Hardest. I don't know. That's a good question. They're all lately, once I went to hardcover, they were all hard, but they're hard for different reasons. Like I wrote Tell Me Lies, and it's a romantic comedy, but in it, a little girl's father dies and she loves him, and that's not funny. So I had to find some way to write that honestly without making the book a tragedy. That kind of thing comes up. And then sex scenes are always murdered, right? I'm sorry, there's no way you can make that easy. So, it just depends on what I'm hitting at what time.
Okay. So if I were a first-time reader of Jenny Crusie, what book would you recommend I read?
First time, easiest way to get in is probably Bet Me. My favorite is Faking It, but I don't think that's as, Bet Me is like ice cream. It's really, there's nothing tricky about Bet Me. Faking It, I kept zigging and zagging, which I love. It's a much more complicated plot. But I think if you're just saying to somebody who's never read romance and you want to read me, there are 1,000 romance writers or readers out there that are just great. I think Bet Me is easy because it's a fairy tale. So it's very easy to follow.
Okay. So Bet Me or Faking It? There's a lot of humour in your books. Does that reflect your attitude to life? Because you seem like a happy-go-lucky kind of lady, and that there should be humour?
Yes. I think the important thing about humor in writing is that it comes from the characters, not from the situation. It doesn't come because the heroine falls down and looks stupid. You don't want to do that to your heroine. But humor is so attractive. I mean, it's one of those things when people are talking about what they look for in a mate, a sense of humor is always in there. And the idea that if you have meshing senses of humor, that you get each other's humor, I think that's a real clue that this relationship is going to work. And it's also a lot more fun to see character based in humor, or humor based in character. Sorry, I got that backwards. That this is funny because this character said it in this situation. It's not just, I always said if you could pull any one of the lines that are funny in my books out and they'd be funny outside of the book, that I failed. Because it has to be within the context of the story. It has to be character based. But as far as my personality goes, my best friend is Ann Stewart, who writes dark, dangerous alpha heroes and tragic, she's great, but her romances are really dark. And she is the sunniest, happiest person I know. Just full of love and opens her arms to the world. And I write romantic comedy, and I'm always the one that's bitching in the back, making snarky comments. So I think it's more of a contrast to my personality than it is to my personality.
Fair enough. Can you remember a time when a piece of reader feedback to you just made you feel so happy? Is there something that stands out?
There's been a lot of great reader feedback, which reflects on my readers, not on me. They've been lovely. But there was one that really, I wrote a short story once called Just Wanted You to Know. And it was about a woman whose husband had left her. And she wrote a letter to him. And then she did 4 postscripts as she changed, over like 2 weeks. And at the end, she basically said, don't come back. I'm better off without you. And Redbook published it. This was quite a while ago. And Redbook got a letter from a reader who said her husband had just left her for the babysitter. And she felt awful until she read that story. And then she thought, wait a minute. You know, this could be good. And that made me feel like that was worth my entire writing career, you know, to be able to do that for somebody. So
Nice.
that's the great one that I remember.
Now, if I ask you to think about your life, what do you consider your biggest achievement?
My daughter. My daughter is the most amazing woman. I could give you a list of her accomplishments. We're in partnership now in the business. She takes care, all I have to do is write. She takes care of everything else. But more than that, she's got 3 beautiful children who are darling, and a great husband and a great relationship and a beautiful home. And she runs her own internet marketing business, and she's just a good person. And I'm so proud of her. The best thing I ever did was give birth to Molly Smith. Everything else pales.
I hope she watches this to hear that, but I'm sure you've probably told her.
Oh, I have. And she always says, Mom, really? Stop telling me I'm perfect. I'm not. But she's great.
So, Jenny, what's your favourite novel by another author? And have you ever told them if they're still living?
I think they're all dead. I love Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett is amazing. And he wrote a book called The Thief of Time that just wipes me out every time I read it. Georgette Hare for The Grand Sophie and The Talisman Ring. The 2 writers that made me want to write the most are Georgette Hare and Dorothy Parker. And I loved their stuff both. Didn't just love it. That's easy. I was so impressed by it. I was so taken by the things they did. What Hare does in Cotillion is she starts out with this heroine who's in love with a rake, who's the archetypal romance hero. I mean, Jack is just everything you want in a romance hero. And then there's Freddie, who's just a nice guy. And she does the best bait and switch on romance heroes I've ever seen. And what she does is she makes you, the reader, fall in love with Freddie just as Kitty is doing it. So you're so immersed in that book that by the time Kitty is turning around and saying, Jack, go away, you're saying, oh, for God's sake, Jack, go away. It's the most masterful use of bringing a reader into a book and having her experience what the heroine does. I love that book. But there are a lot of Hares. The Grand Sophie, The Talisman Ring is fabulous. There's so many of them.
The Grand Sophie is mine.
Oh my God, The Grand Sophie. I just read it again for like the 20th time. It never fails. It never fails.
I agree. So which other authors living do you like to read? And are there any books that you've particularly enjoyed lately that you'd recommend to our readers?
I've started reading I'll get his last name wrong, Aronovich. He writes the Rivers of London series, and I got very hooked on those. I just started a new series called the Murderbot series, which is not my thing usually, but it's fabulous. I love Elisa Whitney. I love Ann Stewart. Susan Elizabeth Phillips is practically a sister. So, you know, you always go back to Susan. They're just, well, you know, you're a reader. You love a million of them. You know, there are so many and you can always go back to them like old friends. So it's really hard to, Patricia Gaffney. Everything Patricia Gaffney wrote is fabulous. There are so many. I could go on for days.
And, you know, there are always great writers coming out as well. So
Exactly. That's one of the exciting things. There was a new romance writer, although she's probably not new. Her first name is Mahari, Mhairi, and I can't remember her last name, and I really apologize. But with that first name, anybody could find her.
Mm.
And she writes lovely urban romances. There was a new YA, I'm not sure it was YA, called It was red, white, and blue something. It was great. It was absolutely great. Kissing Ezra Holt was wonderful. So I am reading some new things, and obviously this was something we should have talked about beforehand so I could get the list. I'm so
No, no,
sorry.
it's good. I like off the cuff stuff. Our
Yeah.
readers will appreciate it anyway. So, if you could choose which of your books was to be made into a TV series or a movie, which one would you choose?
Well, right now, the one I'm writing right now, I think it's just got so much stuff in it. Several of them have come very close. The one that always gets me is Bethany got all the way to, the producers had it in line, the studio was ready to go, but they only had one stipulation, and that was that the heroine not be overweight. And if you've read Bethany, the weight thing in there it's kind of crucial to what's going on. There was no way you could make men thin, and we wouldn't, so we walked away. There have been a couple others that came close. Agnes and the Hitman came close. But in the end, I think they're just too hard to adapt. There's a lot of interiority. But the one I'm just finished and I'm rewriting now, The Devil and Nita Dodd, that has a lot of action in it. So that might be fun. Otherwise, hard to tell.
Good luck with that. But can I say I admire you for walking away? It would have been so easy to say, yeah, make it thin, give me the money. So I admire you for not.
The producers were so good, they weren't going to do it. They came back and said, this is the deal. And I said, no. And they said, that's what we told them to. It was an excellent set of producers on that one, trying to shop it.
You might get another go, you know. It's less about being thin and gorgeous these days.
You never know. I think movie stuff is always pie in the sky. So that's not something, I don't write for the movies. And, you know, every now and then somebody will say, we're going to take an option on this. Here's $5,000. And I say, thank you. But I don't think about it because it's not going to go anywhere. Free money. What the hell?
Jenny, that brings me to the end of my questions. And thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you for asking.
I will just remind readers, Jenny's code for the treasure hunters for this session is 40634608. That's 40634608 for our treasure hunters among our readers watching this session. Don't forget that you can connect with Jennifer at www.jennycrusie.com, and there's an ARRLD Inc. blog that you can follow along Miss Lily's story and keep up with Jenny. And Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today, and wishing you fun and success, and hopefully the coronavirus will finish soon and you can visit your daughter.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you.